Hey Laowinners, it's Law86 here with a stream/video. Hope you guys are doing well. We're here to talk today about whether or not you should be scared or fearful or intimidated by China's rise or China in general. And the reason I came up with this is because I feel like there is so much ignorance and so much stupidity around. And I say that because, and I use negative terminology because I think that a lot of people have unwarranted opinions about China or the state of China currently. I think the opinions are unwarranted because they don't look into it far enough, and maybe they're just consuming stuff at face value, their preferred agenda, I like to call it. But you see it all the way from celebrities, making claims about China, all the way down to newspapers and news outlets and mass media and things like this. And even in general conversation with people that I've been having, it's almost become fact that China has become a global force to be reckoned with, and one that, its ambitions are to replace the U.S. as the global dominant power, which has a lot of nuance to it. We'll get into it, but also at the same time has also achieved all of these things that the U.S. somehow hasn't achieved. And today's not going to be about a pissing contest. It's also not going to be about a, who's better, who's stronger type thing. It's more about the reality of this situation, because the nuance that you need to have or possess to understand this conversation is quite vast, just because of how much China has changed and the actual ambitions of the CCP and the Communist Party of China versus what is portrayed to you by a media outlet that has an agenda to prove something right or wrong. So let's get rid of all of those notions. I have nothing to prove here other than to maybe give you a balanced viewpoint on how you should look at this, so you can come up with your own conclusion, because I'm not basing myself off of how many clicks a clickbait article can get, like a mass media outlet. I'm simply in possession of quite a bit of knowledge about the way that China operates, and I think that it would do people a lot of good to think about it a little past what they've read in a headline. And a good example of that is, the current uproar going on about the Alaska talks. The Alaska talks, the diplomatic talks that China had with the U.S. I'd like to do something completely separate on that the entire dialogue and break it down blow by blow, because the overarching message I'm seeing from a lot of people is that China just made the U.S. its bitch through diplomatic talks, when in fact what just happened in those diplomatic talks was China just solidified its position as having absolutely no friends and allies in the entire world, has shown the world that it's not willing to work diplomatically with other countries, and then push the rest of the world, particularly the Western world, to align together with a more unilateral approach in dealing with China. So it serves people, I think, a lot of good to maybe look into things before they comment on them. I know that goes with anything, but this is one of those situations where I think defeatism and not looking into the actual problems of your own country, and at the same time acknowledging maybe false claims or false victories of another country is actually damaging. And that's what this video is about. It is, to me, quite damaging to look at China's victories that it puts on paper and then speaks to the rest of the world. It's quite damaging to look at those victories and claim them to be more impressive than the victories of your own nation, because there are some simple facts that will kind of, hopefully push you in the right direction of understanding. So to start this off, I'm gonna admit that I was the first person to kind of be proud of China. Not the first person in the world, but I'd be the first person in a conversation to be proud of China. It's one of the reasons I moved there in the beginning, to be honest. I had this underdog thing, and I think a lot of people have this, but to see a country go from zero to hero so quickly, when I moved there in 2008, it was impressive, and it was also the signs that China would probably change for the good. When a country typically gets more wealthy, I say typically gets more wealthy, they tend to want to interact with the global stage, and that's what China was doing, was participating on the global stage. It was a huge manufacturing hub, and it was shaking hands with a lot of countries in terms of economics, at least. And the human rights atrocities were always there. The authoritarian dictatorship was always there. The threat of China to become something so grotesque and evil as it is today, at least the government, It was always there, but there was always a feeling that China would head in the direction of good guy. It would have to become a good guy if it was going to deal with the rest of the world on the same stage. But China always played in this gray area. Yeah, you leave China alone. They'll do their own thing. They have some messed up values over there with the way that they're governed. That being said, we're getting cheap goods from China over here. We're going to let them do their thing. The ambitions of China were not so much we're going to take over the entire world. The ambitions of China looked on paper more like we're going to do our own thing, and you guys can do your own thing. It's not that big of a deal. And that's by and large how the rest of the world treated China at the time. The thing is, this is rapidly changed under the Xi Jinping and the current leadership of the Communist Party of China. We see a China that's trying to have global ambitions much further than that gray area. And the problem with that is that China is not the same country as it was in that gray area period from, I'd say, maybe 2008 to 2013, around then. China has become something much more sinister in terms of its global ambitions that its government is projecting on the rest of the world. I don't think the average Chinese person had global ambitions to go be the villain of the entire world. Obviously not. But the way that the government has whipped up a frenzy of nationalism within China, that's clearly the direction that they're going. And when you look at something like the Alaska talks, you see symptoms of a country that overplayed its hand way, way too early. And I'll be the first to admit that if you gave, under the current leadership right now, if you gave Xi Jinping 5 or 10 more years and he played the gray area zone a lot longer, we could have a situation where China would be globally dominant. But that's the problem, is that when you overplay your hand way, way too early, way before, and you've believed in your own propaganda, you believe that China's already number one, you believe that that your governance style is absolutely top of the pops because you've weeded out any dissenting opinion within your own party or any dissenting opinion within the country, and you've created a surveillance state to where nobody can have a dissenting opinion. You delude yourself. You drink your own Kool-Aid, right? It's become a cult. The CCP went from a tight-knit group of very, very scary, corrupt people to an even tighter-knit group of scary people where all opposition has left the table. There's no more opposition within the CCP anymore. Well, very little, I should say. And this is the issue, is that China has the innate advantage of being able to say what it is, to say what its accomplishments are, to say why it's good for the world and why it's better than everyone else, while simultaneously stopping any dialogue that says otherwise internally, right? So the innate advantage of something like of a country like China in that sphere is that China can say we are the best to its own people, right? The governing power, the CCP, can say we are the best. You wouldn't exist without us. We are the only reason you have money now. Your life is successful because of the CCP. You have to tolerate authoritarian rule, even though most of the rest of the world doesn't have to deal with that. You have to tolerate that because we give you so many opportunities while the rest of the world just shit on us all the time and kept us down, right? They suffocated us, but we pulled you up. And the thing is, the average Chinese person knows that under Chairman Mao, under the exact same government that is in governance today, that suffocating, awful government is still constricting them, is still restricting them. But when you get indoctrinated over and over and over again through the education system, through diplomacy, through the way that China portrays itself on the global stage, you start to believe it. You start to drink the Kool-Aid yourself. And that's the innate advantage, is that the CCP can tell its people, we are the best, everyone sucks, and if there's any downfall or any subpar standard of living symptoms that you might have, they're the fault of the outside world, the fault of the US in particular. Now, the innate advantage is that China can take that same propaganda, that same hypocrisy and lies that it can portray to its own people, and they can pump it out to the rest of the world. Because today, and we've seen this recently, people are too scared to criticize. A lot of people are too scared to criticize an authoritarian regime that has such a loud mouth, because that loud mouth is used for very hypocritical means. China's government is the first government to go claim racism as a valid reason not to criticize the government. So we have a country that's currently running concentration camps, right? Something that I think globally everyone can criticize and would maybe call for sanctions and maybe a more sober way of dealing with China. When you look at human rights atrocities at that level, at that level of unbelievable, like slap in the face, really. If you look at anywhere around the world, their standards for what human rights atrocities would be, China's committing them. China's already committed them. So you're in a situation where China can go around and use the sensitivities, especially of Western nations, let's say America, of European countries, to say, well, if you criticize our government, right? Number one, you can't interfere with our internal politics. We do whatever we want. Number two, you can't criticize our position on the global stage, like our say in the WHO or the UN or all these global organizations, that WTO, that China is part of. If you criticize that, then you're racist, right? If you criticize Xi Jinping, if you criticize the leadership in China, then you're racist. So people are too scared to approach it because it's not white. Those are not white people, right? It's very, very much a talking point when you talk about race politics in the U.S. But when you bring in a minority country, as a lot of people, I've had actual critics, Western critics, white people, criticize me for criticizing the CCP by saying that they are a minority country. It is the biggest population in the entire world, number one. Number two, the government are not their people, right? So to criticize the ruling of a communist authoritarian dictatorship across the pond, obviously I don't have to explain why it's not racist, but that great wall in the mind is actually forming amongst a lot of people, right? The other advantage is that China at the same time can claim victory because people that are uninformed, and let's say the majority of people are pretty uninformed about China, will look at China, and I claim this all the time. People always like to think that China is some very strange, weird country over there or whatever. But I hold the belief that the majority of people don't think deeply enough about China's governance, and that they think that China is just a different version of the U.S. over there. It's a big country. They're competing with America. Obviously they have differences. They use chopsticks and speak a different language. But by and large, it's just another country over there. And I don't think people understand the nuance and the way that different countries operate and how important it is to make those distinctions. Because when the country, the spokespeople, the foreign spokespeople of China make the claim that China has eliminated poverty, they make the claim that they don't interfere in other people's business, they make the claim that the Chinese government only promotes happiness and diversity and getting along with other countries. When they make all these lies that are just blatant lies, they're absolutely not true. When they make all those claims, people tend to, if they have a very passing interest in China, take that at face value. And the issue with that is that automatically becomes this black and white comparison to their own country. So you would say, let's just say you have a very passing interest in China, and you hear that, hey, some celebrity said that China just eliminated poverty. Meanwhile, we're over here and there's lots of poor people. Maybe you yourself are in fact poor. You're missing the distinction that the average poverty standard of the U.S. is about $13,000 per year, right? That is very poor. That sucks. Imagine making $13,000 or less a year in the U.S. would in fact be poverty. It would be classified as poverty, and it's horrible. It would be a very difficult life. It would be a struggle. Now, you would think that, China will eliminate poverty automatically. In your mind, that means if you knew that the poverty standard was $13,000 a year in America, you would automatically think, well, that means that that's where China is at. That means there's nobody in China making less than that. What a victory. What you don't understand is that China's poverty standard is around $400 per year. So when the Chinese government comes up with this massive plan, they say by 2021 we're going to eliminate poverty, and they haven't. What do they have to do? Well, in the National People's Congress, the leader has to get up on the podium and say, yes, we defeated poverty. There's zero poverty left over. Meanwhile, the standard is $400 per year. You're comparing $13,000 versus $400 a year. So you see how that works. China gets the PR. The authoritarian government gets the PR. The people don't get a benefit. Their people haven't been lifted out of poverty yet. You're talking about $400 a year. That's on the level of some of the poorest countries in the world, right? So you go out to the countryside in China where people still have to rely on government food banks, things like donations and stuff like that. There are very, very minute, small government programs within China, nothing compared to the U.S., that are not allowed to exist anymore. And the reason they're not allowed to exist anymore is because Xi Jinping or the Chinese government has declared victory over poverty. So if you've declared victory over poverty, then poverty doesn't exist anymore. And that means that the people that are actually in poverty can't get the benefits that they previously had under the admission of the fact that China had poverty. So you bring that full circle, just that example. You're talking about a country that has the ability to constantly lie and promote its own agenda abroad and domestically. Get away with it because the average passing person with passing interest in China will take that at face value. Meanwhile, criticize their own country, in this case, the US, by saying, oh, we haven't eliminated poverty. Oh, we have this problem that China doesn't have. Because at face value, that's the nature of the beast. That's just how it works. Innately, the US's disadvantage in this propaganda war would be that everyone, including Americans, criticize America. So abroad, everyone abroad criticizes America. America's always been the poster child of hate. People hate America. People simultaneously love America as well. But people hate on America for its issues. It's the poster child of this experiment that we call democracy, this experiment that we call a melting pot. It's a beautiful thing. It's also innate disadvantage is that it's self-critiquing, and it's also getting critiqued from the outside world, which is great. That's fantastic. That's why I think America operates. People like to consistently, and this is coming from a perspective of somebody that's lived abroad for 10 years. People consistently like to say, oh, America's going to collapse. America's like the Roman Empire. America is this unstable society. It's falling apart. And that's only because you have the luxury of being able to say that. You have the luxury of being able to consume media that says that, and you have the luxury of being in a country where all eyes and fingers can point at the problems and they can be dealt with. Whether they're dealt with in a timely fashion or effectively is a different story, but they can be pointed out and dealt with. When you talk about the opposition, or you talk about the adversary of the U.S. ideology at this point, and we talk about China, where everything is dictated by the top-level government, then there is no luxury for those things. So you innately have this self-critiquing society within the U.S. that is starting to ignore its strengths and then simultaneously appreciate the strengths of an authoritarian government that has an open tap on whatever it can say, and it can shut that tap off for its domestic populace, or honestly, at this point, the rest of the world for any critique against China. So when people say to me the comparison to the Roman Empire, the fact that America's collapsing and falling, and the weakness and downfall of America, to me that shows the strength of the country. Again, as someone that lived abroad for 10 years, you get to see, especially if you understand the language and the people and the culture and the way that China operates, you see what an absolute paper tiger the government actually is. It's one of the most insecure, even down to the rituals of a government meeting, down to a dinner of government officials. It's the most unbelievably wussy society you've ever seen in your life in the way it's governed. If you look at the way that politicians talk to each other or government officials talk to each other, the way that they have to preserve each other's face, I'm not talking about culture of face like Chinese culture, like you'd see maybe in Taiwan or Hong Kong. I'm talking about the culture of fragility within the Communist Party of China, the ratting of each other out, the distrust of everyone, the cutthroat ladder where everyone is selling each other out, literally basically calling each other out behind closed doors to achieve power within this very, very vacuum-based political system. You see that that's actually a fragile society. That's a fragile society in terms of the way it's governed. A fragile society is not one that can self-critique. To me, that is the strength of a society. But on paper and on media, and with a lazy populace, to be honest, a lot of Americans are innately and incredibly lazy in the way that they consume things or try to understand things. It would look like a disadvantage, right? So what I want to get into is actually the goals and reality of China. Because I watched something from Bill Maher the other day that people want me to commentate on. And I think he got a lot of things right about the US, and I think he got a lot of things wrong about China. And that will be it. I'll probably make an entire video about a blow-by-blow reaction to that. But it's very convenient, and I think it's very lazy to make the comparison between the US and China. I understand that those are the two big competing powers. It's kind of like the Soviet Union was with the US. I'm no America apologist. I'm probably one of America's biggest critics, but I do talk about China. So I'd like to make these comparisons and base them in reality versus what you might want to think or what your preferred agenda likes to tell you. And again, I hate to keep going back to the Alaska talks thing, but I posted something about that on Instagram about how if you think that the U.S. got its ass handed to them or that China has somehow made the U.S. its bitch because of that meeting, then I feel sorry for you, because that means you have been consumed by your own preferred agenda. And I got people saying like, F you, like, why are you being a shill for Biden? If you walked away from that post thinking that I was shilling for Biden, then that shows you that you've already fallen victim to your own agenda. And it goes both ways. If you guys have known my channel for a while, you'll know that I'm neither a Republican nor am I a Democrat. So, and that doesn't make me innately unbiased. But to look at policy versus big man politicians running their mouths, or what their stooges do in a meeting or whatever, is very much the lazy way to look at it. If you actually look at what happened within those meetings, you'll understand that China just alienated itself like a 12-year-old. So if you're coming out of that thinking that China just made the U.S. its bitch diplomatically, without understanding what diplomacy actually means, I mean, this is a diplomatic meeting, not a pissing contest, like I said, then you've already fallen victim to like a 12-year-old ideology. Like literally like a 12-year-old going to school and rooting for a bully versus beating up another kid. It doesn't make any sense. You have to look at policy in the way that the world is coming together versus an alienation policy that China is promoting right now. And the people that you saw sent to that meeting that are running their mouths and making all these like jabby statements and stuff, you might think that that's like high energy alpha shit. But you know what that was weak man shit, because what they're doing is just running their mouth to impress Big Daddy back home, because Xi Jinping can't be wrong about his new let's go punch him in the face and punch him in the stomach, we're not silent anymore bullshit, hypocritical rhetoric that's basically destroying China's reputation abroad in every country around the world. The only reason that they were running their mouth at those talks was because they're impressing Xi Jinping, who does have the intellectual level of about a 10-year-old in terms of diplomacy. So anyway, what I wanted to bring up was I'm not shilling for the U.S. and I'm not going to apologize for America's many, many problems here. That being said, there are plenty of voices out there that do, talk about America's deficiencies and what we can do with them. It's called everyone. It's literally the conversation of everyone in America. So I think those voices are well saturated, and you can come up with your own opinion about that. However, the voice surrounding China is very, very lacking, because whenever someone has an opinion about China, it's either that China is amazing and it believes all the bullshit propaganda and sucks it down like chocolate milk, or it's the other opinion that, China is like a backwards backwater country that will never achieve anything because they're so poor, because they have outdated thinking on that. Let me provide a little nuance for you here. I read an article the other day which was fascinating, absolutely fascinating, and I thought was almost spot on, which is something I can rarely say about articles regarding China. But it was called China's Not 10 Feet Tall. And it was sobering to finally read that. It's not that I came away learning a whole lot. I came away saying, finally, people are putting this out there, putting out some nuance about this whole situation so that people can consume this, absorb it, and maybe come up with a much, much more accurate conclusion about China. And basically what it was saying is that China's issues or claims that it makes are not necessarily true. And when you believe them, you start to ignore your own country's problems, or basically become defeatist about your own country's problems instead of wanting to participate in making them better. Or at the same time, it makes alarmist policies. And alarmist policies are not what I've ever advocated for American policy towards China. Alarmist policies lie in the fact that you think that China is this massive beast across the pond that is going to overtake everything in the entire world if we're not careful. And the alarmist policies are rash thinking. They're things that cut China off from everything. And that's never what I've advocated. I want the Chinese government to behave better on a world stage, and I want them to stop acting like children, so that actually we can come to some agreements and conclusions, and they stop doing things like, genocides and human atrocities and creating a slave populace out of their entire country. Those things obviously are very hard to rectify under the current leadership. But I'd like to cover some things that might sober you up about what China's current situation might be. So first, what you have to understand is that China offers the easy path to success. Not real success, perceived success. And that relies on people's ability to absorb lies, right? China ultimately wants its authoritarian Leninist system to be respected around the world. China doesn't necessarily care if a country becomes authoritarian and Leninist like them, because the whole nature, what you have to understand is that the global overtaking nature of the Chinese government is actually just for self-preservation. So China has global ambitions. I keep talking about these global ambitions through the Belt and Road Initiative, through its buying of dictators in different countries, particularly in Africa and places like South America and in some places in Europe. It does this for its own gain, and people are quickly realizing this. I've claimed that the Belt and Road Initiative would fail from day one, and the reason people have called me cocky about that and how ridiculous you are, but I've seen how government initiatives work in China. It's just for face value. China, I kind of claim that back in the day that you would probably end up seeing empty trains showing up just to tick off the quotas into these countries, where China was basically saying that if you allow us to build your infrastructure, then you give us more or less a piece of your country or influence in your country. Very quickly that started to happen, and a lot of these countries around the world are very, very quickly realizing that these empty promises from the Chinese government are not because China necessarily wants to be some massive global superpower. It's that China wants to preserve itself, right? China wants to preserve its own leadership. So the quicker that they can get other countries to fall in line with the fact that this is just how China's going to be governed, it's going to be an awful dictatorship, and we're going to, speaking on China's behalf, we're going to be able to get away with whatever we want, and that's just how it is because we bought you now. Countries are quickly realizing that it wasn't out of altruism. The propaganda was out of altruism. We're going to invest in your country and you're going to have such a better life because China really cares about you. All turns out to be bullshit. And when you live there in China, you understand that's even how it works domestically, right? So China needs the rest of the world, not necessarily to become like China. China needs the rest of the world to respect its authority in how it governs itself, because only then will the world back off and maybe reduce sanctions or have a more cozy approach to how China operates and then leave them alone, right? So it's this tricky balance. China didn't have to be like this, but that's the path that they've chosen. And every country has its own interests in mind. Every country is looking out for itself, but the thing is, China is not. You have to take that out of perspective here. Put it in the perspective of this government has its own interest in mind. So the U.S., of course, has its own interest in mind. And whether that can be the military complex or whatever you want to come up with, a lot of the deficiencies in America has to deal with in terms of its PR abroad. The Communist Party of China has only itself in mind. It's not their own people. That's why you would have things like saying we've alleviated poverty while leaving a huge chunk of the country still in poverty for face value. Is because at the end of the day, the Communist Party just wants the very distilled members, the very distilled nature of the CCP, the center, the control, to be safe and protected from any harm or disruption. And the issue with that is that it can't, because of that very nature, because China can't even criticize itself within its own leadership. And this is something that used to happen. The criticism sessions of the CCP used to happen. They were structured in that the core of the CCP would listen to other CCP members in private meetings. This is not people within China talking about the issues that China has, but people within the core leadership of China would have to listen to other party members to understand how and what is going right and how and what is going wrong so that they could experiment with policies around China. We saw that. This was like a real thing. China experimented with policies throughout the country, and we'd see things like, you would probably see some old YouTube videos or something on PBS back in the day where a village is experimenting with democracy, right? They just wanted to see how it was going. Those glimmers of hope were exactly why people were backing China, and myself included back then, is because when China starts experimenting with policies like that, it's only natural for it to continue on that trajectory, to experiment. Maybe it doesn't end up a full-blown democracy, but it ends up better than it was, right? The transition away from Maoist ideology, the transition away from horrible, horrible policies into a country that maybe can start to blossom and grow into itself, just like Taiwan did when the dictatorship was voted out. It was all there. It was in the air. The feeling was in the air. But unfortunately, because that nature is gone, the self-criticism is even gone within the party, because Xi Jinping has reduced the party into just a collective sycophant club surrounding himself. that self-criticism is gone. And here's some of the issues that China is going to have to deal with. Number one, I just smacked the mic. Number one, the working age population is shrinking. So previously you had 8 workers for every retiree, right? So if somebody's retired, you have an aging population, right? You have 8 workers for them to basically keep the economy going. And soon we're going to have a situation where it's going to be 2 workers per retiree. It's a symptom and a hangover of the one-child policy and now the two-child policy. China is not replacing itself. So yes, you have a huge population, but you understand that that's not an innate advantage. A huge population can be your detriment when you have a massive elderly holding you down. The elderly population in China is not working age. They do not work. Therefore, they are not contributing. They're not contributing to the economy. They're taking away from it, right? So you have this issue where the U.S. still has very decent, by world standards, decent birth rates. And one very important distinction to make is that a slew of foreigners from different countries rush into the U.S. And we're talking about talented foreigners as well. You guys can, out there might have your theories about immigration, the immigration issues that the U.S. has. And we do have many immigration issues. But you can't ignore the fact that we have tons of talented people from different countries, from the Middle East, from Europe, from Asia, from all of these places that come to the U.S. to work and participate in the American system, because the American dream is still very much alive for people that can appreciate it, that don't come from here, to be honest. The people that aren't spoiled and can understand the amount of freedom that's allowed and granted to them within U.S. borders. Nobody is rushing into China. You might see some shills on YouTube that like to, suck the jiba of the CCP to extend their visa for living there. But there is no mass influx of foreigners rushing into China that you would see in the U.S. People vote with their feet, right? What system is ideologically superior if foreigners are rushing to one country to participate in an open economy versus a country that foreigners are not rushing into? That to me is like it's a very big wake-up call to people that are chiding China's system of authoritarian governance. People aren't rushing there. The Chinese government would like you to believe that China is accepting all these foreigners and all these foreigners are pouring into China for a better life, when in fact that's just not the case. The second issue is that China's debt has doubled. And by the way, this list of problems that I'm going through is probably, if we're going to really sum up the title of the video, is probably why you shouldn't be immediately worried about China. But after I go through these, I'm going to go into the issues of why you legitimately should be worried about China. China's debt has doubled. It's currently 300% of its GDP. And the thing about that, now, I mean, people like to just pish-posh and say, whatever, it's debt. Every country has debt. The national debt in the U.S. is not to be scoffed at, that's for sure. The problem with that is when you have a high debt country like China that's still developing. So we can say very safely that the U.S. is a very developed country. China is a country that's still trying to develop past basic manufacturing, right? And don't let anyone tell you differently. China is not a juggernaut in terms of anything but manufacturing at this point. When you want to make a demographic shift as well from low-level manufacturing, so we're talking like making your rubber balls that you're throwing around out back, or you're making a grill, or you're making basic items for, luxury items for countries in Europe or the US and things like that. When you want to transition from that, a low-level manufacturing country, into a high-level manufacturing country, or a country that doesn't even bother with that kind of stuff, like Taiwan, for example, you can't have crippling debt. Taiwan was a country that didn't have to deal with crippling debt. They had such a good economic start to make that very easy transition for them from low-level manufacturing to a chip juggernaut. Look at, a good test of that is go look at Taiwan's GDP, like per capita, versus their per person GDP, right? If you change it for purchasing power parity. Taiwan makes, I don't know, let's just throw out there, I can't remember the figure, but let's just say like $26,000 per year. It doesn't sound a lot, right? But when you adjust that for per person, I think it's upwards of $50,000 or $60,000. I believe it might even be higher than the US, because economically they're on such good grounding. Whereas China has crippling debt. It's a massive part of their GDP. So you have a problem with China's going to have a huge difficulty in transitioning from that low-level manufacturing position when it has to deal with national debt at that level. Another thing is that the party, I've already mentioned this, but the party is concentrated completely around Xi Jinping. So you have a situation with, and I don't mean to bring this up again, I'll use a different example, but you had situations where people would vote for a mayor, right, in their town. The CCP would watch over everything with freaking hawk eyes. But at the same time, it would send information and send ideas for policy change within the Communist Party of China back up the ladder, back up the stream. And it eventually would reach the leadership. It was policies like that that not only give us hope, but also caused China to change into a more mature country. And those are gone. I said that before. I'll say it again. Those are gone now. The problem is that those experimentation policies, those very things that made China start to blossom and mature into a country that people could take seriously, are the very things that separated it from Maoist policies that collapsed China in the past, that led things to tens of millions of people dying in recent modern times. We're not talking about the 1700s here. We're talking about the 1950s and 60s. Maybe you or your parents were born around that time. We're talking about policies and governance style that's going back to the very thing that Chinese people were so terrified of in the past. We're going back to those policies. So when we had situations where Chairman Mao, because of face and power and greed, went on the global stage and said, screw the rest of the world. We have millions, hundreds of millions of people that I'm willing to sacrifice. I don't care if they live or die. And this is Chairman Mao saying this. I don't care if Chinese people live or die. We have power in numbers. We will be a force to be reckoned with. And his policies, for example, grain. He told everyone that we need to stop going to school. Everyone needs to go out in the farm fields. And this happened to my parents-in-law. They had to go out and leave their professional jobs and go work in the fields as a peasant. Everyone had to learn how to become a peasant to increase China's output, right? When they did that, China's output shot up. But do you know why? Well, it's because Chairman Mao made it illegal for you to not hit those quotas. So if a village was subpar in how much grain they were outputting or food that they were outputting, what did the party leader in that village do? Well, they lied about it. They would say, no, we hit those, and they would pad the sacks. They would pad the numbers. Ultimately, what that would do is lead Chairman Mao up at the top to say, well, look at this. Not only are we hitting our quota numbers, because these people are too scared to be complicit in this, by the way, not only are we hitting these grain numbers, these food numbers, we have a surplus. We can export. He was obsessed with competing with the Soviet Union. People like to think China and the Soviet Union were buddies. It's outside of the propaganda posters, the reality was not true. The Soviet Union did not respect China in 1 ounce or 1 inkling. Chairman Mao exported the grain into the Soviet Union. You know what that did? Well, it led to tens of millions of people starving to death in China. But no one was willing to complain about that. If you did, you get the death penalty. No one was willing to point that out, because if your head is on the line, then you're dead. No one was willing to point out the policies, for example, when Chairman Mao tried to kill all the sparrows because they were eating the grain. That led to a locust problem, which caused even more widespread famine. You weren't allowed to point these things out because the nature of China was an utmost authoritarian dictatorship. Chairman Mao's rule was correct. He was a cult figure, and he led to the worst famine in modern history. He led to one of the worst, the worst death count within a short period of time of any atrocity in mankind. People didn't want to go back to that. People didn't want to go back to a situation where they're beating up their teachers in the street and going back to the peasant life and being poor. People were very happy to experiment with policies like something called capitalism that allowed China to become the power that it is today. People were very happy to go not be in a situation where they basically weren't allowed to speak their mind or do anything or participate in the global stage because of Chairman Mao's policies. Yet, here we are, in this very same thing, with Xi Jinping emulating Chairman Mao's policies. Xi Jinping is emulating the very nature that Chinese people are trying to get away from, that Chairman Mao instituted. Do you want some proof of that? Look at what happened with the coronavirus. When the coronavirus broke out, under Xi Jinping's leadership, people were so goddamn scared to say anything because they knew that they would get blamed for it. Because Xi Jinping has created a very small army of sycophants that won't tell him any bad news. He is the monster of his own creation. When he got rid of any competition within the party, or got rid of any dissenting opinion, or got rid of anybody that's willing to say anything, who's not a pussy, he got rid of everyone to propel himself to the top. We're back with Chairman Mao 2.0. And the coronavirus is exactly why we can see that these policies are detrimental to China. When you're too scared as a mayor, as a party official within your province, even as a town official, to say anything about coronavirus cases, because the next guy up said, we can't say anything about this. This can't get to the top. We're not responsible for this. When you have a system like that, nothing can be done. So just like tens of millions of people died in the famine under Chairman Mao because nobody could tell him or nobody would do anything about it because of the power structure that had been created, it was exactly the same. You had doctors that were like, why are people dying of pneumonia? You had people in the scientific community in China being like, we need to be more careful about this. We had people that were seeing the deaths and destruction of the coronavirus in the beginning that were getting silenced, arrested, thrown in jail. We had state media project right in the beginning, do not talk about the coronavirus. It is a rumor. Don't spread this bullshit. You will be in trouble otherwise. You are on the line legally, and you will be punished if you talk about the coronavirus. That was on headline news, on the news, with a woman saying it to the Chinese populace. Because of that very power structure that we're going back to with China is the reason that we need to care about that. Because look at, I said this in the beginning. I say this in pretty much every conversation I have about China. But China is not just China's problem at that point. The coronavirus, what you're dealing with today, is because of the power structure of the CCP. Yes, things after that happened. Yes, poor leadership in other countries and poor policies were in place. We're not equipped to deal with something like this. But it's very much because of the power structure that the CCP operates in. And the biggest victims of that are Chinese people abroad, Chinese people within China that have to deal with this. I say Chinese people abroad because they have to deal with the repercussions of what the government will do to them, even when they're abroad because of family back home. And I say Chinese people within China because Chinese people in China can have nothing but apathy under the current structure. When I go back and say all of these policy experimentations that were going on within China that were making the rest of the world's populace pretty happy and excited, I'm not underselling it. Like, I'm not overselling it. I'm actually saying that those policies, that glimmer of hope, is why people were respecting China at the time. And the reason that people should be worried about China today is because they don't understand how fragile it actually is. You're looking at the achievements of China being put out there by Bill Maher and people like this. You're looking at the achievements of China being put out there by state media and the world lapping it up. But what you're failing to understand is how fragile those achievements are, and a nation that has to lie about its achievements to the rest of the world is a fragile nation indeed. And fragile nations with fragile leadership do very, very stupid and crazy things. And the effects of a pandemic right now, because of the leadership and the pig-headedness of it and the immaturity of that leadership, is very much there's global consequences to that. That is not just a domestic populace that has to deal with that. So for me, that has my heart in China, that I deeply care about China. Obviously, I have more prerogative to care about what's happening in China, but the average person that doesn't have a goddamn hope in the world or care in the world for China still needs to care as well. The concentration of power, the full-on dictator style that China is in, has led China into a situation where the mildest of critiques is met with jail time, disappearance, even worse, familial pressure and punishment. There is no chain of command where negative things that need to be dealt with within China go up to the leadership, much less even the media. There's no dissenting opinion anymore. And the reason that's an issue is not because, oh, look, China's a nation of slaves under the government at this point. The reason that's alarming is that that style of governance or that demand for respect is now being pumped out into the rest of the world. And when you pump out the demand of respect for an authoritarian dictatorship that's currently committing genocide, and you actually get the world populace in line with that, at least a portion of them, like with tankies and things like that, or people that have a very passing interest in China that are latching onto these ideas, it also has a negative effect on domestic policies within a country because things can be overlooked. Confucius Institutes, why were they allowed in the US? Would you ever think of setting up a Soviet Union institute so that the education systems of the US could open welcomely Soviet principles, ideals of communism and authoritarianism and dictatorships, the whitewashing of genocide and murder? Welcome that into your school and then teach that and then accept US government funding to promote an ideology and a regime that wants your own country dead. Would you ever think that would happen? Of course not. Do you know why? Because people aren't crazy. The problem is that in this day and age, the coerciveness, the amount that the Chinese government has actually entered institutions is the part that people should be worried about. The thing that people should be worried about is the fact that for God knows how long now, government institutions have literally been in the education systems of the US, not only promoting ideology, but harassing Chinese students that come from China for a chance potentially at a better life or a better future or an opportunity to participate in democracy or democratic values. To allow an institution like the Confucius Institutes to come into an education system and harass the Chinese students there and say, you are not allowed to participate in this. Your family is screwed back home if you do anything, if you participate in democracy, and keeps an eye on their students. We allowed a government institution like that to operate within the borders of the US and continue to do so. Policy change says otherwise nowadays. It's going in a different direction, thankfully. But we are in a situation where people are too scared to point out the fact that China is already part of these international institutions, and it's not wrong to call that out. I don't know how I can drive this home anymore, that you can't have a country that operates concentration camps, harasses its own citizens abroad, promotes its ideology of absolute lies and hypocrisy, and wants the rest of the world to kowtow to it as it acts like a 12-year-old bully and continually takes advantage of the rest of the world for its own power structure and benefit. I don't know how to drive it home anymore that that's not wrong to criticize. And the people whatever that apologize for the CCP can try all they want, but you'll be on the wrong side of history if you continue to have that idea. Because the innate strength of a good person, the innate strength of a country that at least has ideology, at least has principles of democratic nature, and at least believes in equality, that country's innate strength is that it's not going to tolerate that kind of stuff. It's not going to tolerate a bully that gets to dictate its own way throughout the world. China is acting like an immature, spoiled bully, and it's not liberalizing to any sort of extent to where the rest of the world should respect it. So I think it goes much deeper. I'll cover some more points here. I got a couple notes here. Outside of a couple countries, I shouldn't say a couple, outside of a few developing nations that are beholden to China, one of the reasons you shouldn't be worried about China is that in general, the world populace is not looking favorably on the CCP. And right now, only 20% of Americans have a favorable opinion about China. It's something I don't like to see. I wish that Americans would have a favorable opinion about China, but the problem is that I don't want anyone to have a favorable opinion about the current governance of China. It only serves it only serves detriment to the world. That's because of the own government's doing. China's been nonstop pumping out soft power propaganda. It's been censoring Hollywood. It's been dictating the global opinion about everything, and unfairly so, just because it has a financial stake in pretty much the world's entire institutions. However, you can pump out propaganda all you want. You can self-censor and try to make China look as good as you want. But what you have to understand, I'm talking to the CCP here, is that what you've done is completely backfired. Because when you have a 20% approval rating for China amongst the American populace, after you've already pumped in that much money and global influence to try to change the narrative about how China operates, then you screwed yourself. And unfortunately for the Chinese government, the rest of the world is falling in line. Australian opinion is lost to the CCP. Most of Europe's opinion is lost to the CCP. North America, Canada, are you kidding me? And even the developing countries that was very favorable towards China because of the infrastructure projects they were getting are turning. In China, what they have to understand is that you can't act this way diplomatically and expect the world to fall in line. This isn't back in the emperor times where everyone needed China's gold, so they needed to suck up to the emperor. The global supply chain does rely on China, but sometimes people's pride is a little too good for that. And right now we're seeing a fairly unilateral approach towards China. We're not seeing the opposite happen. We're not seeing the rest of the world saying, yes, we are going to be like China. We love it. We love you. We welcome you with open arms, CCP leadership. So that is another reason that the trajectory for the approval rating for the CCP is very negative, and that at least is probably starting some sort of dialogue or conversation as to why that is. Another issue, another reason you shouldn't be afraid of China is because of how much shit it has to deal with back home. China is bordered by 14 countries. Okay, that's a lot. Look at the U.S. Barely any, right, in comparison. The U.S. on immediate borders, we have Canada and we have Mexico, both of which you can say all you want about our past regime, like under Trump and things like this, but our relationship with both of those countries, albeit strained compared to the past, is nothing like the shit show that China has to deal with on its borders. China's bordered by 14 countries. 5 of them are disputing with China over territory. Look at India. Look at the territorial dispute with India. There's no positive love in India for the CCP. You have Japan, India, South Korea, and certainly Vietnam that are absolutely no friends to China. When you have bordering countries like the US and Mexico and Canada and the European Union countries, you at least want to have normalized relations with those countries. China's surrounding countries are no friend to China. Vietnam in particular. I mean, you look at Vietnam, it's a communist country with an authoritarian dictatorship. You'd think they'd get along, but absolutely not. It's one of China's worst enemies, simply because of historically how Vietnam's been treated by China. Russia has often looked like an ally to China, but you guys couldn't be more wrong. You might look at things like a joint Mars project or moon project or space project. You might look at things like, maybe there's some inner workings about a pipeline deal. China and Russia still are not allies. When push comes to shove, China and Russia, out of just mere basic interests, might have their back, but that's where it stops. China doesn't have, particularly domestically, an actual ally. North Korea is its only real ally on paper, right? You might throw in Pakistan in there, but even that's changing. China doesn't have countries to back it up. And that's what happens when you treat the world like shit. That's what happens when you shit on the rest of the world. People don't like you, right? When you are the least charitable, internationally charitable nation in the entire world, and you sign agreements that make these countries beholden to you and have to sign over ports and land and rights, then countries are going to start hating you. And that's not a good look. That's why I keep going back to this gray area thing. China in the gray area was thriving. What happened? You can't swing your dick around in a world in a climate like this when you have nothing to show for it. When you continuously take advantage of something, people are gonna hate you. And I'm talking about the CCP leadership here. And given the correct information, the people of China wouldn't be very happy with the CCP as well. But that's just what happens when you block off your entire populace from any sort of international dialogue. China's favorite thing to do, and this is something I would like to go into a deep dive of propaganda about this. The Chinese government right now is pumping out this message that Chinese people love America and that there's no bad blood. This is their new coercion technique. If you watch any Chinese media or you speak Chinese or you're seeing what the Chinese government's pumping out to its own citizens right now, it is nothing but vitriol against the U.S. It is a pure hate fest for the U.S. It is, if you think American media is negative to China, what most of America is negative to China about is maybe human rights atrocities or playing unfair or IP theft or tangible things, right? The vitriol being spread around by the Chinese government against America right now, within the borders of China, is straight up bullshit hatred. It's straight up America is trying to take advantage of us. America is a massive bully. We're going to win. We could win in a war, threatening war, this nation of peace that it calls itself. It's pure hatred and vitriol. Yet the current propaganda shift, the soft power propaganda shift that China's trying to push right now, is that Chinese people have absolutely no animosity towards Americans. While that might be largely true, I mean, all of my Chinese friends don't have hatred for the U.S. What it's doing domestically to pump up nationalism and to get rid of any sort of respect that America had within the Chinese populace, what they're doing is very much not what they're putting out there. They keep saying, Chinese people, we as China loves America. We love American people, blah, blah. And they're doing they'll put out these street interviews from 2005, 2006, all the way up to maybe 2010. They'll put out street interviews, and they're street interviews of people walking around China saying, what do you think of America? And people say, democracy. I like America. Hollywood. Movies, things like that. And then they'll have the influencer, the Chinese influencer, they'll have them say, see, there's no bad blood. It's just American media that's promoting this hatred of China. And I'm sitting there thinking holy shit, this is actually going to work though. Because if you don't speak Chinese and you're not consuming Chinese media, this is actually what you're going to think is happening. It's this victim mentality that the Chinese government likes to throw out there. And it's just pure deception. It's pure deception. But again, this kind of stuff has a tendency of backfiring. Now, another reason that's a massive issue for China is that China has a massive food shortage. I actually saw some, oh my God, you actually can't make this up. I saw some influencers within China. I could just call them shills, the people that stuck around and shill for the Chinese government. By the way, I have nothing against like China vloggers. I used to do that too. I have a problem with the people that literally only talk about how good the Chinese government is with a Western knowledge of knowing actually how not it is and what a detriment it is to its own populace. But so I actually saw some of the shills go out there and say, see, China doesn't have a food shortage. Look, I'm at a market. There is food here. Look, I am eating at a restaurant. My belly is full. That is the level of intellect they expect you to have to buy something like that. Now, China does have a food shortage, and I'm not talking about is there food at the markets. I'm talking about their future supply of food. China is a heavy, heavy importer of food for its own populace. And in military conflict or any sort of conflict, the Chinese Navy is not strong enough to be able to stop a blockade. So China doesn't have a ton of arable land. It can't feed itself. And that is an issue. That is a future issue. China would rather have pay influencers to go out there and pretend like there's not a food shortage by showing vegetables in a market, but the reality is not that. You can fake reality as much as you want, but it's not reality. And the last one is total lies. It's just total lies. Eventually, that luxury of being able to portray yourself as a global leader and everything you do is amazing and everything you do is positive and incredible and there's no negatives about your governance, eventually that comes crashing down. And that's what you're seeing with approval. Policy change right now towards China is getting to be fairly unilateral. It's not something we saw before. It's something that as Western power is actually allowed to happen because of the future hope that China would democratize or liberalize at least. But they're not even going down the route of somewhere like Singapore. They're going down the route of previous Chinese leaders. It's full circle again. And eventually when you lie enough, you're going to piss off the rest of the world. You may have mastered the art of tricking your own populace and saying, okay, yes, please, sir, I'll have some more, and then roll over because you can't do anything about it. I'm not blaming the Chinese populace for not standing up to their government. No one can do anything about it. It's a very, very heavy surveillance state with very big implications if you step out of line. That being said, the rest of the world can do something about it. And unfortunately for the CCP, the PR of China is not because of the Chinese people. The bad PR of the Chinese, they like to put it on that. They'll say like, oh, the bad PR against China is about racism. No, the bad PR about China, unfortunately, dear CCP, is your own doing. You've made your own country, and people like me who absolutely adored your country, all the way down to people that don't even care about your country, suddenly start to care about your country in a very negative way. And it's all your fault. It's all based on your governance. It's all based on your party's leadership. It's not a good look. And when the world comes together against something like that, you're all of a sudden this fantasy that you're this unstoppable juggernaut of a force. That goes out the window because the rest of the world is in disagreement with what you're doing. It won't just stop at, oh, please stop doing that. No more. Don't do that anymore. When most of the world wakes up to what's happening, it's all over. You either have to fall in line and start behaving, or something bad happens. And that's just the nature of the beast. No one wants to see that happen either. Unfortunately, with enough prodding and pushing, that might be what happens. To really sum it up, should you be scared of China or worried about China? You should be aware of China. You should have a nuanced and balanced approach to how China actually operates versus a fantasy about the successes that it portrays to the rest of the world, because by and large, they tend to be false. And also, don't be scared of China in terms of the infiltration of China in your own country. Be aware of it so that the dialogue can be created and there's awareness that the Chinese government is evil, if not more than what you may have previously thought. I think the current trajectory of the world's approach towards the Chinese government is currently correct. But I think it's also important not to be alarmist over it because China is currently digging its own grave. That does not mean complacency is correct. But what that does mean is that conversations that lead past reactionism, that lead past rash policy changes, conversations that lead into how this will be effective, how we can deal with this in the future, how we might be able to even instigate some change, positive change within China, is the correct conversation to be happening now. And to all the way, always praise China for its accomplishments and then always look at China as a non-factor is both detrimental to your own country as to other countries diplomatically, countries that need leadership. At the end of the day, the innate strength of the U.S. is that people want to come here. We have a self-critiquing society, and we have a country that can still honestly make change throughout the world, whereas China can do nothing but bolster its own image, promote authoritarian dictatorships, which is a very hard pill to swallow for a lot of people, and ultimately might end up with it in its own demise. But to understand it clearly is the most important thing that we can do right now. Let's go to some super chats. China got caught showing their true colors. That is correct. The world is waking up more every week with this nonsense, and change is inevitable. And this is exactly how I've thought about this whole thing. I implore you to go read the transcripts of the Alaska talks before making any judgment about that. I think anyone that actually read it or had like a general understanding about what happened in that meeting would probably have a very different opinion than they have now. Kyo-Young Kim, China being a minority country is safely the most white-centered racist in its core sentiment I've ever heard. And I fully agree with you. Sometimes these people that go and make their entire life's narrative to make sure that that the CCP is not demonized end up being the most racist people in the entire world. To me, if you are pro CCP, then you are racist against Chinese people because you want them to fall in line like sheep, and you don't think that they have their own opinions or lives. That means that, yes, Chinese people are different than me. Like, pretend I'm like this massive apologist, like social justice warrior for the CCP. I'm a white dude, right? I go out there, I burn the American flag. I say, yeah, China's got its head on its shoulders. They're doing the right thing. That means that I believe that Chinese people are inferior to me because they can't even have that same opinion that I have. The freedoms and democracy in the institutions that I'm a part of here in America that allow me to be an apologist for China, Chinese people aren't allowed to have that. So you're being inherently racist to Chinese people. So I agree with you, Kyo and Kim. CCP is a regime that does not care about life, the environment, or anything that doesn't make money. This type of government can never last, and it won't. And yeah, I mean, by and large, I do think the CCP is not going anywhere. Its own demise, when I say that, it's its own demise globally with its global influence. I do think the CCP will definitely retain onto power. Whether they do that successfully to the benefit of their own people is probably not. Sick lid, hit the like people button. Thank you. AL3 Bruds. You and Winston should reach out to Tim Pool in the DC area to go on his show to discuss China to a broader audience. He'd bring a great perspective. I actually laughed because I thought you were part of the Tim Pool meme. There's like a meme on our live show podcast where people keep telling us to go on Tim Pool. And I thought you were participating in that meme. People kept pushing us to go. We'll go on any show. We don't really care. But people got us in contact with Tim Pool like over a long period of time. It took ages for that actually to transpire because like we were both emailing each other at the wrong places or something. But we decided that after we get the vaccine that we will we'll fly out there and go on the show. Han W. Doing my Sunday morning drive in my Miata and had to pull over and load up this video. Great analysis as always, mate. Keep it up. Thank you, Han. Han's awesome. He's been a friend of the show for a long time now. And he drives a very, very pretty Miata. Mao de Mighty. Lao 86 is supported by the official Mao de Mighty. So would you kindly PHUCK OP you damn Wu Maos. The CCP is evil. Taiwan pineapple. Hong Kong love. Tibet check. You forgot Xinjiang. Thank you. Reminder, China is not the CCP. Its citizens are great people who deserve to be freed from tyranny. And if you don't think that, and you're new to the channel, or maybe you're not new to the channel, if you don't think that after watching my videos, then I apologize that I did not explain well enough. But yes, if we don't separate the CCP from the Chinese people, then we're doing the world a damn bit of disservice. That's for sure. Seth Wilson. Hi, C-Milk. Hey, buddy. Septarshi Sengupta. Hey, C-Milk, could you tell me how members of People's Congress earn their seats? Are they elected in some way, or are they nominated by Xi? So actually, instead of answering your question here, I might do an entire structure of the CCP explained. But a very simple answer is that it's about who you know, right? So you'll serve as a party secretary or a town leader, maybe get to a mayoral position and work your way up. And maybe you'd be a provincial leader, just like Xi Jinping was a provincial leader of Fujian province. And then eventually you'll work your way up. But the inner workings of it are more like, who can I get rid of? How much power do I have? It's a very interesting power struggle. Mr. House, the U.S. needs to drive a wedge between Putin and the CCP to exploit it to the max. The Russian Far East might as well be a part of China. I absolutely agree with you, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of... I won't get into my opinions about that right now, actually. I feel like I would need to explain myself properly, but I do think you're absolutely correct in that sentiment. From an American policy perspective. Sander Gearson Oswald. Hi, Milk. Do you think China's upcoming elder wave, well, I like that name, elder wave, will collapse, significantly damage the CCP due to their increasingly worsening economics? It will be a huge problem. But it's one of those things. China's very much a long thinking, like play the long game, but at the same time has policies, usually because of the CCP, that are so short-sighted. So that could be a huge issue in the future if the housing bubble doesn't collapse first. Hosted says, keep up the good fight, man. Thank you. Jay Leo says, since you lived in Inner Mongolia, I visited Outer Mongolia in 2017. I went to Ulaanbaatar, Hutsai and Gork Terej, and I also stayed with a Mongolian family in Agur. You should visit as a tourist next time, and I absolutely will. I've been inside of Outer Mongolia by accident twice now, but not meaningfully. I would love to, absolutely love to go to Mongolia. It's one of my dream countries to visit. I can't wait. Once the world truly realizes the CCP is just grown up North Korea, it's game over. And yes, you're absolutely correct. Thank you for actually understanding my sentiments. I thought I would see a lot of salty hatred because I didn't play into people's narratives. I tend to not do that. There is a problem with a lot of people is that they'll come in with a preconceived notion and they're not willing to budge after I have said my piece. Whereas I'm not chiding myself, but I'm constantly ever changing my opinion about things because it's the only way you can stay on top. It's the only way you can have an informed opinion. Roids SX381. Thank you and Winston for everything that you bring forth. I'm dating a girl from Taiwan and she agrees with you both. America needs to wake up or else we'll end up like the CCP of China. Time to wake up, people. Yes, I do think that's alarmist. I don't think that we will end up like the CCP. I think there can be some slight parallels, but by and large, no. I do think that the CCP's dastardly actions need to be accounted for, however. And I do think that allowing the CCP into institutions in the U.S. is a massive foible, and we will deeply regret it in the near future. Armin Bjornsson, thank you. Alt Stuff TV, late to the vid, gonna watch it later in full. I watched Thursday's live yesterday. I wanted to support Lao86, peace and love with peace and love. Usually peace and love, it means you're gonna say something negative. Like, with peace and love, you suck. I'm joking. Thank you so much, Alt Stuff TV, that's awesome. Tom Shipman, send the pandas back. She's family should be in prison. Slap Prazi. That's a set of 3 demands where I can only make one of those happen. A new member, thank you, Roids. Appreciate it. E. Clay Thompson, thank you. Dion Chapman, would the CCP be able to survive if she had a heart attack? Not that he has one. Not that he has a heart. That's good. Yes, yeah, of course. There'd be a next in line and a next in line and a next in line for sure. CCP is all about self-preservation, and they are not, although they are fragile in the way they operate and their feelings, and actually ultimately to the core, the thing that's not fragile is them retaining power at all costs. I'm not talking about over the world, but at least over Beijing. Nimbus Cloud, thank you. Greetings from Finland and greetings from the US. Tervetuloa. Recently, Chinese investors tried to buy an airstrip up north in Finland to access the North Pole. Yeah, I saw that. I think that this is just China colonizing the world. It's super scary. And that is something that I think people are actually realizing at this point. It's not that it is too late in many aspects, but I don't think this, like if you were on a super chat 5 or 10 years ago and you sent that to me, I would be like, "Wow, really?" I don't think most people would actually know that was happening. Whereas the fact that you know about it and I already knew about it and we're talking about it now means that there is some awareness and possibly future prevention. But I am an optimist. Bjarn Hall, wearing my Wumao t-shirt, watching this. Keep up the good work. Thank you, man. Hunter, would you ever take a position doing diplomacy between the U.S. and China? I absolutely would, and it's something I might consider in the future. Thank you for that. But diplomacy is something that I think is incredibly necessary, and I think, although we're on the right track now, we've been doing it wrong for a long time in regards to China. Ryu says, in a case of CCP collapse, could the KMT come back? No, the KMT would not move back into China. Taiwan's main ambition, including the KMT, is that Taiwan is its own entity. Ultimately, it's that the Taiwan identity is not so much reclaiming China anymore. It's so much as acknowledge us as a country, for God's sakes. We've been operating separately from China since ancient times, since 1949. Blue Six, YouTube is censoring my freedom of speech. I hate the CCP and protect our U.S. Chinese citizens from hate crimes. They are not at fault. Yes, absolutely. Hashtag stop Asian hate, and you're a piece of shit douchebag if you think that Asian people have anything to do with the CCP's dastardly deeds. I shouldn't need to say this, but apparently I still do need to say this in 2021, that violence against Asian people is wrong, and you are a fucking bastard if you think otherwise. If you are using your own personal insecurities to take it out on an Asian person under the guise of saying that you don't like China, then go screw yourself. Exa from the Ashes. Thank you very much. I remember I'm just supposed to call you Exa, right? Son of the D. Son of the D. I'm planning on holding a protest here in Iceland to boycott China's Winter Olympics. I don't want my country to support genocide. And you do that. You do that. And send me photos and send me some videos of the whole situation, and I'll definitely put you guys on the podcast. I'd love to see that. Keep it up, Iceland. Fight the good fight. Peter Santenello, my good friend Peter. I actually just filmed with him the other day. If you guys don't know who Peter is, definitely after this is over, and if you haven't watched the Alaska Talks, by the way, definitely go check out Peter's channel. It is awesome. He started out in Ukraine. He likes to do personal interest stories, and eventually he moved over to the U.S. to do some America content, and his America content's been fascinating. He spent a bunch of time with Hasidic Jews to see how they operated, some Amish people. He just got out of the most dangerous hood in Miami. He does fascinating stuff. We just collabed last week, actually, in person. And it was a huge, it was like one of the best people I've ever met coming out of YouTube, because usually when I meet people, it's just like, whatever, business as usual, but I feel like I came out of that with like a very close friend. Peter's absolutely amazing. Casper C. What's up with all that gray hair, Lamau? Well, I'll tell you what. It is not by design and not by choice, but my grandfather went pretty much fully gray by 33, and I'm now 34, so I'm very much catching up. I'd say I'm about half gray now. Cultured Yabo. Thank you. That's an oxymoron if I ever did hear one. Mark Griefer, when do you expect serious change in China for the good to happen? A few years, decades, not any time in our lifetime. Within China's borders, I can't tell you. With the way that China exerts itself abroad, I think we're going to see a change very quickly because there's no alternative. When the rest of the world needs you to fall in line and stop being an asshole, then typically it happens. China is not to answer the question about should you be worried about China, it's not the global superpower that you might think it is. Within China, on the other hand, CCP rule over its own populace is going to be a while, and there's not a whole lot difference in the way that North Korea operates. So keep that in mind. David Newfield, decoupling the rest of the world from essential reliance on PRC manufacturing and supply chains may be the most effective way of curtailing the CCP, and I 100% agree with you. Curtailing the influence of the CCP relies on deleting its source of money. The only reason, and I say this all the time, that the Chinese populace can tolerate authoritarian rule of the Chinese government is because their life was better than it was in terms of economics, like in terms of how much food they have, in terms of how much money they have, than it was under Chairman Mao or previous regimes, right? When you take away or threaten money, I'm telling you right now, the most fervent nationalists in China might start rethinking. Carl G, thank you. Matt N.A., thanks for your honest analysis. And thank you for watching, man. And for the super chat. Cultured Yabo, thank you again. With a little blush. And Julian Kolbis, China Uncensored, keep representing it like the PRC might invade Taiwan any day now. What are your thoughts on that? That's a good way to end this. Strategically, for its own populace and soft power, China needs to invade Taiwan or continuously make the threat that it's going to invade Taiwan. Usually the soft power of saying it's going to is enough. They've been doing that every single year. No leader of China is different. It's been ramping up, however, because of the implications of the global supply chain. If China can take over Taiwan and take over chip manufacturing, then China's got a huge ace in the hole. That being said, it's the global prerogative now to protect Taiwan because of that. Taiwan is one of the biggest chip manufacturers in the world. We need Taiwan. And it's something that was not acknowledged before. But Taiwan played the best bit of goddamn diplomacy I've ever seen in my life. It's the best bit of like 4D chess I've ever seen, because they simultaneously had China, which is bullying to bomb it into out of existence basically and take it over, and then simultaneously had the rest of the world not acknowledge it as a country, so they weren't beholden to it, to a point now where the rest of the world can't acknowledge it as a country, but simultaneously needs to protect it to protect the global supply chain of microchips. And then China's like, shit, we can't do anything about it. So it's pretty fascinating. Culture Yabo, thank you. Vif Goal, thank you. Carl G, thank you. Oh, and Don Strausberger. Very generous. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you. I think you and Winston would be great ambassadors to tour the USA. How can I make this happen? And actually, I just mentioned Peter before he gave a super chat. My friend Peter, the YouTuber, he and I both, in talking, came to the conclusion that I think that Americans are very much out of touch with how good America actually is, but not from a propaganda perspective, not from like, gosh darn it, this is the best damn country in the world. It's from the perspective of the opportunity is still here. People are still flocking here. And by and large, at the end of the day, America offers an unparalleled experience for being an individual, an unparalleled experience for doing your own thing. And that is something that needs to be reignited. And because we don't have the propaganda arm like the Chinese government does, just forcing propaganda about how amazing our country is down our throat, we live in a self-critiquing society. People like us, we'd like to point that stuff out because I think it's getting lost. It's something that only I realize after living abroad for 10 years, how great America actually is. And it's not that I'm in a honeymoon period or I drank some Kool-Aid. It's that I saw it for its faults, left, and then came back and said, I'm being a lazy piece of shit. I'm going to do something about it. And actually seeing how much fruits that America has to offer. I do acknowledge that people come from different circumstances and it's not an equal society by any means. That being said, I have not yet seen a very, very convincing alternative. I think America is a fantastic place. Misopable, thanks for the vids. I hope to travel China one day and make friends. Not fight him, help him. Thank you very much, and I agree. I hope you guys liked the video. If you did, I was going to tell you to hit the like button, but I don't actually care about that. If you did like it, I think you would have done it anyway. One thing I might ask you to do, though, is make sure the bell button next to the subscribe thing is clicked, because what I've noticed is that I think it's like 1% of my subscribers are getting bell notifications, and then people are like, hey, I didn't see your video on my feed, right? So if you have that selected, that's great. It'll help out. I want to say, first and foremost, thank you to all my patrons at patreon.com/Laowai86. You guys are the only reason I can do this. As you guys have known, I lost all my sponsors. Pretty much, I think I only have pretty much only NordVPN left. So you guys keep this channel going. People are too scared to apparently sponsor a channel that is against the CCP, maybe because their supply chains are still there or because they are afraid of repercussions. That being said, if you're a follower of this channel, you are not afraid of any repercussions because the truth is the truth and we can't ignore the truth. So I want to say thank you to the people that support me over there. I want to say thank you so much, Laowinners, and I'll catch you on the next one.